Ah, come in, come in. Have you missed me yesterday? Yeah, I know. I know, I had more important things to do. However, who didn't have more important things to do today were the Taiwanese people 126 years ago, because they declared independence from Japan on this day, forming the Republic of Formosa. Now you're like, Eisen, I'm American, I really don't know geography, I couldn't even point Europe on the map, let alone Formosa. I never even heard of it. Well, that's normal, because Formosa lasted for just about your average World of Warcraft content patch, because it lasted for 150 days, 4 months before Japan went and took it back, since at the time it was still controlled by Japan, took it right after a war with China. So it would have taken roughly 55 years for Taiwan to become independent, this time not from Japan, but from China, in a pretty weird and unique way, but we're gonna leave it there. I don't want to offend the great and glorious leader. So moving on to something lighter today, we are going to rev up our tinfoil hats. We are going to start and support our manias of persecution, our conspiracy theories and accusation of favoritism and nepotism. Of who, you may ask? Well, of Blizzard, of course. Today we're going to explore which specs do we think Blizzard has a soft spot for, which of the specs have been favored and sheltered throughout the various expansions of this game to be made more playable, more powerful, more viable throughout the years. Because, you know, when you look at just one tier, one chunk of an expansion, you can't really gauge anything. Even if you look at 2 tiers and then 3 tiers and the entire expansion, you can see maybe a small indication in a single expansion, but it doesn't really give you enough of a track record. Then you start looking at 2 expansion and then 3 expansions in a row, and you're like, I seem to be seeing these couple of specs present and popular and powerful for several years, whereas I haven't even seen a single living soul play this spec. What's up with that, Blizzard? And that is when you start asking questions and getting yourself convinced of several theories. So now we are going to explore these conspiracy theories and see which of the specs definitely Blizzard loves or hates, or has loved and has hated throughout the existence of this game. Now, because there is like 36 specs, we kind of have to go quickly here, so we're gonna start with the tier of the Forgotten, the C tier, almost middle. You might be thinking, well, isn't being forgotten by your developer kind of bad? No, I mean the tier of, we have developed a spec which is working, which is fine, it's playable, it can do its thing, and we can just let it be. It's not gonna be too bad. We have Protection Paladin, we have Guardian Druid, Balance Druid, we have Elemental, Shaman, Vengeance, Demon Hunter, and then Frost and Unholy Decay. Protection Paladin has never, at any point of its existence, been the top tank to play. You have had Guardian Druid, which has followed a similar path. They have been popular more than Paladin in a few tiers, but never really major, never really very popular. Compared to other tanks we will see, you have gotten Balanced Druid, which despite the position they are in right now and the popularity they have had right now, over the course of the game, you can't really claim Blizzard has kept a favorite spot for Balanced Druids, definitely. The exact same can be said for Elemental Shaman. Elemental has gotten sometimes good, sometimes bad spots. Blizzard seems to have kept it in an alright situation without too many problems. On a similar note was also Vengeance. Yes, despite its stark rise in popularity in this tier, in Legion and BFA, the only 2 other expansions where Vengeance has lived, you can't really claim that this spec as a whole was very popular. As a matter of fact, it was amongst the least popular tanks. And going back to the part about being sort of left there by Blizzard, this tier, this expansion didn't really change too many things for Vengeance. Just a couple of tiny things which, together with the Covenant abilities, together with the meta change in Mythic Plus, made them way more popular, but over the course of their existence they have been rather okay. Same goes for Frost and Unholy. I don't think there is any room, I don't think you can find too much evidence, if you are the accuser, of Blizzard's favoritism and preferential treatment towards Frost and Unholy Death Knight. They have mostly been rather okay as specs throughout their existence, which is also newer compared to the rest since they came in Wrath. Although saying newer, mentioning Wrath is a little bit weird. Now going in the tier a little bit above, which is still rather nicely balanced, but still we start to get a little bit of an eye of attention towards these specs. We have Fury, Arms, and Protection Warrior. Much like I just mentioned for Death Knights, it's clear that Warriors have been in a higher and more prominent spotlight compared to Death Knights. They have gotten way more use out of their unique things, starting from Battle Shout and Rallying Cry, particularly Battle Shout. They have kept this meme, which has been hidden, has been treated as a meme by the Warriors, so that other people wouldn't realize what was up. This meme about scaling, about the fact that nearly every single expansion, the deeper you go, the stronger Warriors become, which is not a type of luxury that many other specs can have. They have gotten this for many, many expansions, and Blizzard has always granted them this spot. You can't also discount the bonus points, because Blizzard basically developed Vanilla and TBC with Protection Warrior in mind, as the guy who takes damage in this game is the big guy with the shield and the sword. Over the course of the expansions, yes, it has gotten less of a thing, clearly, but they also kept that special spot for quite a bit of time, so they have been definitely treated with a bit more attention compared to other specs. Then you have the Hunters, Marksmanship and Beast Mastery. Of course, one is missing. Marksmanship and Beast Mastery have also gotten decent treatment by Blizzard over the course of the tiers and the expansions. Hunters have always been also very popular, ever since Vanilla. You know, the idea of having a pet, having a cool wolf next to you when you were 13 looked kind of cool. Blizzard has always kept these specs very relevant. They have always been part of the raiding scene. They have always been given, probably because of the idea that they are a hunter with a pet and they are very self-sufficient. They have also been given in-game self-sufficient tools, the very high mobility, the utility of having things like casting on the move, plus immunities, plus traps, and all these useful things that you could have. They've always had quite a bit of polish to the way they were working, they were functioning. The last two of the specs in this list are going to be Discipline and Blood Decay. We start Blood because we just left Unholy and Frost a tier below. As a tank, Blood Decay has gotten a little bit more of an attention from Blizzard. Yes, technically, when Wrath came out, Blood Decay wasn't even a thing, it was just a talent setup, but more broadly, Blood has been pretty popular and pretty updated by Blizzard. Discount the fact that right now, Blood Decay is not very powerful. You still have 10 years of expansions to go back to and look at how Blood has done, and they have certainly done well. They have certainly been kept in the meta multiple times, most of the times, by Blizzard. So when you compare Blood to Frost and Unholy, it wouldn't be fair to keep them into the same tier. Blood deserves to be higher. The one that probably is more surprising to you is going to be Discipline, put into the B tier, put into the mostly middle of the pack. You would be saying Discipline is S tier. Discipline is, the OP spec that's always everywhere. It's true, Discipline would be there. The problem is that for Vanilla, and then Burning Crusade, and then Wrath of the Lich King, and then Cataclysm, Discipline would have to be into the F tier, into the shit tier. Discipline wasn't even a spec. You weren't even spec'd Discipline. At best, you were a Holy Priest spec'd into Spirit buff, or spec'd into the Stamina buff, or doing PvP with some extra defensives down the Discipline tree. That's the extent of usability of Discipline for many years. It just didn't even feel like a tree, like a talent tree. It was just a secondary thing you went for. It is only after Blizzard took it upon himself to specifically curate the reworking of the Discipline tree that it became way more oppressive when it came to healing, when they were given the whole atonement thing, the whole create shield instead of creating healing, doing damage while creating shields, etc, etc. So only for half of their life they have been S tier. So if for half of their life they have been very high and half of their life they have been very low, then we're just going to leave them in the middle. Now, before leaving for the higher tiers of specs, we have to go down though. We have to go to the bottom, we have to go to the specs where, unlike the C tier we went over, which were specs that Blizzard kept an eye out on, modified a little bit a few times, made sure they were still viable very often. The D tier is the tier where sometimes specs end up being there a little bit too long. Sometimes they end up being forgotten for a little bit too long of a period. They have some bad mechanics and bad interactions with their spells and abilities that Blizzard doesn't seem to mind for a bit too long. So, in this tier, we start with Arcane Mage. Arcane Mage is the obvious choice when you look at the other two mage specs which haven't appeared yet. Arcane is definitely the ugly, dumb brother of the three. For the first chunk of the game, they had this reputation of being the spec you went for when you wanted presence of mind, when you wanted arcane power, and you wanted to make your PvP videos with metal music and one-shotting people. That was just about the extent of playing Arcane, and it kept up expansion after expansion as not really being very popular. Very rarely it was very strong, or at least very usable in raid encounters and in the modern game in Mythic Plus. So it has definitely felt abandoned at times by Blizzard. Other specs falling in here. We have two of the more contested ones, which are Retribution Paladin and Shadow Priest. Because right now, Retribution Paladin is living a little bit of a resurgence. They have done and gotten better in BFA. They are still doing fine in Shadowlands, so not too much to complain. However, very similarly to what we talked about with Discipline and what we didn't talk about, but it's still the same, Balanced Druid and even Elemental a little bit, they failed to be a proper real spec for quite a bit. Retribution was a very big meme back in the days where the talents weren't really a proper spec. They were more like an indication of what you could go for, and Retribution didn't come to be its own spec for quite a long time. And even after it did, there was quite a bit of a stigma around Ret, like it wasn't a real spec. If you were a melee DPS, you were playing Rogue, or you were playing Warrior, or even Death Knight when it was out, Retribution was a little bit slower on the start of its own reputation. So yeah, right now it would certainly be higher. Right now it would have gotten a little bit more of a attention from Blizzard. It would be closer to the B tier than where it is now, but we have to look at the entire existence of this game. Otherwise, the accusations towards favoritism of Blizzard don't count. If you only just look at the last couple of expansions, it would be recency bias. It wouldn't count. The other spec I mentioned is Shadow Priest, which is very similar. Shadow Priest has lived in limbo for several expansions. TBC was basically used and abused by raid leaders to give out buffs and debuffs to be a mana battery for the raid. In Wrath, and then Cataclysm, and then Mists, and then Warlords, it was bad. It was a convoluted spec which required complicated rotations. You could go into Mind Spike, Shadow Weaving rotations, the more complicated rotations in the game, alongside Feral, and even then you were still doing less DPS than a 2-button Hunter. They always struggled to find its spot until there was the attempt at reworking them in Legion. You know, with Insanity, the Surrender to Madness addition, which made many people fall in love with Shadow. It didn't fully work. Eventually that turned out to be too strong. It had to be retuned and nerfed to the point that by the end of Legion it wasn't doing too good. People were afraid it was going to go back to irrelevance like we had in previous expansions, but instead in BFA and Shadowlands it continued being curated and tuned by Blizzard. On a similar note, it spent a lot of expansions into the F and D tier, and now just recently it has gotten a little bit more attention, but overall it is still a quite left behind spec by Blizzard. At the very least, you can't deny the attempts of Blizzard recently to fix them, to rework them a little bit. After these first four, we have the other four in here: Subtlety, Enhancement, Holy Priest, and Mistweaver. For Mistweaver, an enhancement is going to be very quick. They are here because they have been very unpopular and unplayed and very rarely being the best at what they did for too many expansions to not put them here. You know, if they had been given enough attention from Blizzard and enough care compared to other specs, they would have gotten away from this hole earlier, which they didn't do. Mistweaver lived a pretty popular time during its release. It was also pretty strong during its release, but it quickly faded away. They even had a pretty decent start of BFA. In the first tier and the first season of Mythic Plus, it looked like Mistweaver was going strong and then, again, just disappeared. This time, they didn't even get a good start like Legion or BFA. This time they were dead since the start. It definitely felt like a forgotten spec, together with Enhancement possibly even more. Yes, again, they have been given more polish and a rework in Shadowlands, but it's still over the course of 15 years, which is very little. The other two are Holy and Subtlety. Holy Priest is basically the opposite of Discipline. Holy Priest was the spec to heal with for the first part of this game. It was very popular, it was very strong, and then, obviously, the more Discipline became strong, the least holy seemed like it was necessary. They have started the real drop in popularity and the feel like Blizzard didn't care for them together with Mistweaver ever since damage reduction abilities became very important for raid encounters, and Blizzard hasn't really given any attention to the specs who do not have these damage reduction abilities, so they deserve to fall into this tier. The last one in here is going to be Sub-Rogue. I have voiced my displeasure before at the fall of Subtlety. Subtlety has always been the edgiest of the specs of Rogue and often the least played of the specs of Rogue and very often the least viable of the specs of Rogue. So if you take this for multiple expansions, for multiple tiers and multiple balance tuning and Outlaw and Combat, as well as Assassination, very often end up being the strongest ones and Subtlety very often always falls short, then you can blame Blizzard. You can put on your tinfoil hat and say they don't like Subtlety or they have trouble making it viable. Now, before going to the shit show of the bottom tier, we have to go into the A tier, into the closest one to the top. Let's start with the ranged DPS repertoire, the first three being Frost Mage, Affliction Warlock, and Destruction Warlock. So Frost Mage, again, not very surprising. Frost has been a staple of ranged specs since vanilla, and it has continued to do so for 15 years. It has always been curated by Blizzard to the point that it was always viable. Even throughout the course of an expansion, you more or less always found a way to have Frost being powerful and strong, so it can't be any lower than A tier. On a similar note, you have Affliction and Destruction. Ever since the good old days of vanilla, followed by TBC and the one-button spam of Destruction Warlocks and their Shadow Bolts, it has continued being amongst the always present in Blizzard's mind type of classes, Warlock and Mage. And the thing continued, being given things like portals, being given things like Healthstones, dispensable raid-wide Healthstones, as well as your Soulstone combat res to this class, filled with these special things, Mage too with Arcane Intellect. It just feels like they hold a special place in Blizzard whenever it's time to balance things. Then we go on the brothers who heinously left behind their little brother, Assassination and Outlaw. Outlaw and Assassination, much like Affliction and Destruction, have been the two specs of Rogue to be relevant since vanilla all the way to now. Assassination and Combat often exchanged priority and power throughout an expansion. You would start with Assassination doing fine, and then Combat with their heavier damage on auto attacks and melee damage, and one-end weapons doing more damage, eventually with more attack speed, more haste, higher item level, and more stats would eventually do more damage, while Subtlety was still in a corner, getting dust, being unused, except for some hipsters trying to PvP with it. And unlike what I mentioned with other specs in here, saying, well, at least recently the trend has changed, Shadow Priest, Retribution Paladin, at least recently the trend has inverted for them, not really for Rogue. Mythic Plus is introduced, they have Cloak of Shadows, they still have their immunities, their cheat deaths, their ways to be needed, their special ways to be needed, so it does make you wonder, it does make you conspire against Blizzard, it does make you accuse Blizzard of conspiracy in favor of rogues. The other two specs in the A tier are the Restoration Brothers, Druid and Shaman. Shaman has been a staple of raiding for a long time. They have not really gotten the same attention, the same focus by Blizzard when it comes to Mythic Plus, which is why otherwise I would have put them into the S tier. The opposite goes for Restoration Druid. I just mentioned Holy and Mistweaver being into the D tier because they lack damage reduction. One of the reasons was they lacked damage reduction for raids. Restoration Druid is the only one that broke that mold. Even without damage reductions, they were so useful. Their throughput was so high, and the way in which they heal, which is carpet bombing the raid with healing over time, was still so strong that they made it into the raids regardless. And this goes all the way back to TBC. For 15 years, they have been very popular in raids, regardless of their cooldowns. And for long periods of time, Tranquility was still a very strong healing cooldown, being able to heal everyone, regardless of whether or not you are stacked. If the raid is moving, doesn't matter, just click Tranquility. And then there is the extra, which is Mythic Plus, which Druid has dominated for 2 full expansions. Now, they aren't, but it's not enough. They are still clearly an A tier spec when it came to the attention that Blizzard gave them. Now, what is left is the top and the bottom. I don't think you can mistake the specs that are left with top and bottom. So let's go one and one. The first spec of the bottom is going to be Demonology Warlock. Much to no surprise, it is the only spec of Warlock which doesn't make it into the A tier because, well, it has been rarely played. Blizzard hasn't given them much of any attention. They have been given a rework recently, you can say, considering the game is 16, 17 years long, with the new way of playing, with imps and implosion, with the Hand of Gul'dan, your demonic tyrant, plenty of pets they can summon, so they have gotten a new polish recently. But over the course of the game, they have certainly been left to rot for way too long to be justifiable by Blizzard, whereas the first spec at the top is going to be Havoc Demon Hunter. Well, the tale of Havoc Demon Hunter is much simpler to tell, because they just came out in Legion, so it is much easier to see why they are in the S tier. For the entirety of Legion, they were meta. From the release, they skyrocketed to the most popular melee DPS spec in raid encounters and the most popular melee DPS spec in Mythic Plus. This kept up for nearly the entirety of the expansion and then continued in BFA, while they continued to be one of the more popular raiding spec for melee DPS and the first to second most popular melee DPS spec for Mythic Plus together with Rogue. This is the first tier of the first expansion in basically 5 years that Havoc has not been the be-all, end-all of melee specs. And even then, even in this state, they are the third most represented spec in raid encounters and the third most represented melee spec in Mythic Plus. So this is the scope of the focus that has been given to Havoc by Blizzard. People have mentioned this multiple times. The double jump can legitimately make you dodge mechanics. They have an offensive dispel. They were the first spec to be given a resource whenever they got a proper interrupt out, which was unique and given to Havoc Demon Hunters for no reason. They, of course, couldn't miss having a talent giving them an immunity. Why not? An AoE stun, of course, sure. A defensive, why not? Why not give them darkness, a raid defensive? So clearly extra attention has been given by Blizzard to this spec when they thought about it for Legion. There shouldn't really be any debate on this spec being into the S tier. Going back down into the slums. Survival Hunter. Well, no surprise here. Survival, in a very similar note to Discipline, was barely even a spec at the start of this game. It was a spec you spent a few points in. Very rarely you would go deep into the Survival 3. Eventually, almost like an anime redemption arc, Survival actually managed to turn into a very good spec, and at times even the best spec for Hunters. The good old days, peaking all the way up to Mists of Pandaria, Survival Hunter, possibly the best iteration of Hunter in this game, until Legion struck. Unfortunately, the attention of Blizzard became so much that it ruined the entire spec, because now it has been turned into a melee spec, which nobody is playing, nobody wants to play, and everybody just wants to go back to the range version. So it couldn't not fall in here. Even if we account for the good old days of the couple of expansions where Survival Hunter was good, the struggling first expansions where it barely functioned as a spec, and the latter expansions where it was butchered into a melee spec, have to end up into the bottom tier. Now back up into the S tier, we have Brewmaster Monk. Well, Brewmaster Monk, on a similar note, ends up here mostly because of their stagger mechanic. They are the only tank spec in the game with this unique mechanic, which clearly Blizzard doesn't know how to balance. For many parts of many expansions, Brewmasters have scaled out of control with this mechanic, being able to cheese a myriad of mechanics that other tanks would otherwise get one-shot by, or would simply not survive, which required things like taunt swapping, which required things like soaking, and Brewmaster could just laugh it off, because they had stagger. This level of attention has kept them very, very popular throughout the expansions ever since their release in Mists. They have always been the shinier of the Monk specs, as opposed to Windwalker and Mistweaver. This expansion as well, they are the most popular tank for raids together with Vengeance, and they are still the second to third most represented one in Mythic Plus. They had even more representation last expansion, as well as in Legion, so they have kept up and been more or less the more represented tank if we look since their inception. All the other tanks have had much bigger falls than Brewmaster has, basically. And then to crown the accusations to Blizzard of favoritism and nepotism, we have the debuff. We have the Mystic Touch physical damage debuff that now basically guarantees you want one monk in the raid for this debuff to be available. So Brewmaster makes it into the S tier, and then we go back down into the F tier at the bottom to meet Windwalker. Well, this was inevitable. Windwalker had a few tiers where they weren't really F, they were closer to C in terms of Blizzard balancing and tuning of the class and the spec. In Legion, they even had periods where they were very popular in Mythic Plus. They have never really gotten to be very popular as a spec as a whole, which is interesting. When the next melee DPS spec would be released, which was Havoc, it skyrocketed in popularity, but Windwalker not really. The main issue that plagues Windwalker is their bugs, their issues, their failed interactions, the fact that they still live with a shit mastery, with very little scaling. Again, something that you have heard repeated multiple times, the lack of scaling of Windwalker Monk, and the fact that this is still a thing and this is still talked about year after year after year, it can't but make you wonder what is going on with the developing of this spec, which is why it ends up in here. Now, before going for the last two specs of the S tier, we are gonna stop for the last of the bottom tier, which is Feral Druid. Feral Druid is the black sheep of Druid, and it's not that Druid as a whole has been given too much attention by Blizzard. Feral has lived for a long time in a similar spot to Shadow Priest. It barely functioned for a long time. The time it did function, even if you wanted to make it work, you were expected to be a tank druid if you were Feral, not even a DPS. If you were a DPS, you were probably a big memer trying to PvP. Even after it became its own thing, it still had the problems that barely anyone played it, that it was pretty convoluted and complicated as a spec. You had to work 3 times as hard as anyone else to do your rotation, and when you did, you were still doing too little damage, and if you were doing top damage, it was just for a few specific situations. You lacked the AoE burst, the single target burst, you had too slow of a ramp up, you lacked the cooldowns, you had no raid-wide utility to bring to a raid. It was just overall problematic, and this continued for several expansions. We are in Shadowlands and not too much has changed. Many of these problems are still exactly the same. They have been bailed out from terribleness this specific expansion because of their Convoke the Spirits, giving them a proper cooldown, but looking at the existence of Feral Druid over the course of 17 years, it has to be here. It has been way too abandoned for way too long periods by Blizzard to not be in F tier. Now we close with the last two specs at the top. Now I'm sure you should by this point get, even though there is plenty of icons here, it's Fire Mage and it's Holy Paladin. Fire Mage is here. I think it should be rather self-explanatory why Fire Mage is here. Fire Mage was the spec to go since vanilla, I guess after Molten Core, and remained one of the specs to go for 17 years. There is no other explanation that needs to be given. When you are a developer and you keep a spec as playable, as viable, and as popular for 17 years, like you did to Fire Mage, that's it. It's your favorite spec. When you look at every single other DPS spec, and not a single other DPS spec has had this level of viability throughout 17 years, then the answer is already here. Fire Mage is the range DPS spec that has gotten the most favorable trades from Blizzard over the course of this game. You compare it with Balanced Druid, you compare it with Shadow Priest, with Arcane Mage, even with Affliction Warlock, and there is no contest. Fire Mage is just way too sheltered and has been way too protected by Blizzard over the course of the expansions. The other one, surprisingly I guess, is going to be a healer, because Holy Paladin has lived a similar process. Since vanilla, they were intended to be the second sort of hybrid support healer to your Holy Priest. One side had Paladin, the other had Shaman. Blizzard corrected this in TBC, and they turned them into proper healers to the point where they started even already overtaking Holy Priests, and they became the to-go healer together with Restoration Shaman. Ironically, the two specs that were limited to each faction became the two strongest ones for both, and from there it remained a staple. the Holy Paladin in the raid to heal the tanks. That was the reason initially. And it remained a super staple for way too long. Even after their way to heal changed, even after they moved away from being the, so to speak, tank healer, they still found a way to become a very powerful raid healer. They have always had a way of being almost a necessity in every raid encounter. And then you look at Mythic Plus being introduced and they still made it to the top. They still were a viable and represented Mythic Plus healer spec for 3 expansions now. Never the most, because as we mentioned, Restoration Druid held that title, but right behind them there was Holy Paladin. Considering they have been at this level for this long, they have certainly been the most curated and the most protected and tended to of the healer specs so far. So this is the overall compilation of specs given by the preferential treatment that Blizzard has delivered onto them since vanilla. Some of them are there because they received that level for their entire existence, like Havoc always at the top, or Demonology and Arcane towards the bottom, and others are in that rank because it's an average. They have bounced up and down a few times, like Shadow Priest, like Holy Priest, like Balanced Druid, so they end up being there as an average, as a sum of all the expansions. Let me guys know what you think. Question aimed especially at boomers, at the very least playing since Wrath, so you have kind of a good picture of all of these specs' existence for quite a few years, over a decade, in fact, since Wrath. So we have gone over. With this, we can stop with this tinfoil hat theory. Thank you guys for watching this Alex Jones tier conspiracy theory video. If you enjoyed the video, you are formally invited to subscribe to this channel. If you didn't like it, then you're probably a triggered fire mage trying to cope, in which case you have no sympathy from me. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, fucking allergy. My nose has been itching for the past hour and it's so triggering.